Hello, hello, hello. Hope you all enjoy. Let's get started. Chapter 17. Down a Hole. At the far end of the valley, Woolruff sat quivering in the chilly air. She was huddled high in the mountains in a vertical crevice of rock. This was the compromise she had reached for her conundrum. She was in the valley where she could try to observe the humans, or even Mandelbrot if they were here when day broke. At the same time, she would not lead the hunters following her directly to them. Now that she could not see any of them in the faint light down in the valley, in the near regions below her function robots were visible doing their regular chores among the crops. Her physiology kept her just warm enough at this altitude to remain for a while, but she was not comfortable, nor did she have the energy left to run farther. She waited patiently, reviewing the moves she had made to break her trail. None of them could avoid a systematic search by the hunters if they were close enough to detect her heat. Also, the hunters probably had checked the pass at some point, because it was a bottleneck that could quickly tell them if she was inside the valley or out. If her heat trail had faded before they had reached it, they still had physical signs to rely on. She had been as careful as possible, but the robotic vision of the hunters could detect extreme detail. The rest was up to them. Her ears perked up at the sound of footsteps on the rockfall below her. With no more energy left for fleeing, she waited patiently. The giant shape of a hunter emerged from the darkness, thrown into silhouette by the distant glow emanating from the crops below. She knew it would not harm her, but it would take her prisoner and possibly deliver her to Dr. Avery, who could certainly harm her if he wished. She shivered as the hunter reached down to pick her up. Derek was staring disconsolately at the dirt-covered sensor when it suddenly erupted in an uneven spray, knocking loose some of the dirt. Ariel and both flinched. All around them, other spigots were also spraying jets of fine mist into the air. "That's it!" Derek lifted his arms toward her. "Let's go. Can you help me up?" Ariel took his arms and pulled. His legs gave out under him. She wasn't strong enough to lift him. She started to pull again. "I can't walk any more." His lower legs and feet had lost all feeling. "You can't walk at all?" Her shoulders slumped. "But I can crawl. Let's go." "Derek? Come on!" He started crawling through the soft earth, which was quickly turning to mud. She stood and walked alongside him. "This is crazy. We're hardly getting anywhere." "We have a lot more time now. The hunters can't follow our heat trail, so we'll have to start a pattern search. And at least one of them will have to carry Mandelbrot after they shut him down." "Derek, you've only gone 2 meters." He stopped, sighing, and looked ahead. She was right. He could barely move. "Hey, what's that thing?" "What?" She looked too. Some kind of large rectangular shape, at least a cubic meter in size, was emerging from the ground below the trees. That thing there. We haven't seen one of those before." He started crawling again. "There's one behind us too," she said. "And beyond that one. They're coming up all over. They were completely hidden before. We must have triggered them along with the irrigation. Go see what it is." She hurried ahead and stopped in front of the object, bending low in front of it. After a moment she came back and knelt down. "I think we can get inside it. It looks like a ventilation duct or something." Derek nodded. He had stopped crawling to get his breath again. His head was spinning dizzily. When she got down on all fours and moved under him, he let her. She gathered his arms around her neck and maneuvered under him. Then, supporting his weight, she began to crawl much faster than he had, carrying as much of his weight as she could. He hung on with his arms and closed his eyes against the spray of water. "Here," she said after a few moments. He opened his eyes into a gaping black opening with no other features. As she eased out from under him, she reached inside and felt for the shape of the object. "It's not a straight drop." She helped him climb inside. "You can feel a gradual incline." Derek hesitated, too disorientated to speak, but still reluctant to throw himself into an unknown hole. Go on, get in before the hunters see us." He was losing all sense of his surroundings. Following directions was easier than arguing. He worked his way inside the opening, and then suddenly was sliding downward and accelerating. All was darkness. He felt a rush of air, the smooth pressure of the surface against his back as he slid, and Ariel bumping against him from above as she slid with him. Vaguely, he realized he was too exhausted to feel any fear. He should have been terrified of winding up in a moving fan blade, for instance, or in the workings of some mysterious robot creation that would convert them both to fertilizer. Apparently he'd been on Robot City too long for that. The robots couldn't allow that much danger to a human to exist here. No, that wasn't it either. The reason was even simpler. Nothing on this planet was more frightening than the chemfets destroying his body from the inside at this very moment. The sensation of falling continued as they entered some turns, gradual curves, and have finally reached a sudden upturn. In the short ascent, gravity broke their momentum and then they slid backward again. Derek lay motionless, aware that they had stopped in the bottom of this thing, whatever it was. No light had reached them at all. He felt Ariel move a little, probably getting her bearings. "Derek," she said softly, "are you hurt?" A moment passed before he had the breath to answer. "No," he whispered, "but I've had it." "We're safe now," she said, feeling for him and stroking his hair. "At least from the hunters, I'm sure of it. You have to search the entire valley and every one of those things. And theirs were popping up every few meters. It looked like, well, every 50 or 60 anyhow. We've had a heat trail to follow. It'll take 'em forever." "Can't do it." "But we're on to him. Avery, I mean. I'm sure of it." She shuffled around and seemed to stand. "You know that upward curve at the end of our little ride? It's here and not very high. The deck continues on a level from here. Say, you know what else? There are handholds of some kind on the side opposite the one we slid down. Maybe for service robots to make repairs down here." He thought a moment. The temptation to go on was strong. Confronting the crazy doctor after all the suffering he'd endured. But he couldn't move. All he wanted to do was sleep. "I think you're right," he said finally. "This is a ventilation duct. From the size and number of them, it must lead to an immense living space. Avery's home. Robots wouldn't need it or the produce in the valley. Come on, let's go. I'll help you up." "I'll have to go on alone. I honestly can't move." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you really want me to go on without you?" "Yes." "All right," she said slowly. She waited, perhaps trying to think of something else to say. Then she got her arms around him and embraced him very hard, and held on. He was too weak to respond. After a moment he felt her let go and stand up. Then she was climbing, and he heard her moving down the ventilation duct away from him. He closed his eyes and slept. Ariel felt her way forward slowly with her hands as she crawled, not making any move until she knew what was ahead of her. She was still in absolute darkness in some kind of giant tube that was so far stretching straight ahead on a level course. With Derek unable to move, she was painfully aware that she was the last of their group to have a chance at finding Dr. Avery. She was not exactly in top condition herself. Her hands and feet were painfully cold, and she was drenched from the sprinklers. She was worn out, too, though not sick like Derek was. The climb up the mountainside and into the valley had taken a lot of energy out of her. She hoped, with guarded optimism, that her memory was growing stronger. Those weird memory fugues had grown less frequent, and she wished fervently that none would strike her while she was alone in this thing, whatever it was. She began to find branches and intersections in the passageway. Without any way to pick one direction over another, she attempted to go as straight as she could. Going in roughly one direction would at least prevent her from wandering hopelessly in circles. She suspected that the intersecting tunnels represented those other openings in the surface they had seen. After a while she thought she had picked out a pattern. From what she could feel, smaller tunnels seemed to converge more often, and become larger ones consistently to her left. She began to move leftward, and discovered that the tunnels were now high enough for her to stand if she bent over. Now that she was moving in this direction, more tunnels converged around her all the time. Then they started branching out again, some of them splitting off above her. Finally, she realized she could see hints of shapes, dark spaces that represented openings one way, a faint reflection of an inner surface another way. The traces of a light source shone from just one direction. She dropped to all fours again to pursue the light source, now more concerned with making noise than with the height of the tunnel. Around a curve she reached something recognizable, a covered opening into a room. Barely daring to breathe, she moved as quietly as she could toward it until she could peek through the opening. It was nearly opaque. The room was lit, but she couldn't see much. It was carpeted in brown, nor could she hear anything. After the silence had continued, she decided that she would have to risk entering the room. She began studying the edge of the covering to see if she could get it loose. In a moment she found that the pressure on the covering itself caused a hole to appear in the middle. The substance, whatever it was, receded from the hole to fade outward into the surrounding wall until the vent was entirely open. She let out a sigh of relief that the room was deserted. It was still silent as well. After shifting around to get her feet out first, she dropped to the rim of the floor and looked around. It was a small room, perhaps only 3 meters cubed. The brown carpeting went all the way up the walls and covered the ceiling as well. The light came from a globe floating just under the center of the ceiling. She looked again at the ceiling, then the walls. The room was not built in right angles. The corners were slightly askew. A couple of computer tapes were piled on the floor. In one corner a small stuffed animal of unrecognizable type lay on its side. The room was not being used for anything that she could see. This was not what Ariel had expected from Dr. Avery. The door was closed. She held her breath and pushed the stud on the wall next to it. It slid open silently. She remained where she was, waiting. When nothing happened, she stuck her head out slowly. She found a hallway extending maybe 6 meters one way and 4 the other. The hallway itself was oddly shaped, but familiar. Then she recognized it. It was a hollow 3-dimensional rendition of the key to Perihelion. She stepped into the hallway. The closed doors at each end of it were also shaped like the keys. She chose one and walked toward it. This one opened as she reached it. She hesitated, then edged through. Her mouth dropped open in surprise. This room reminded her of some ancient historical paintings she had seen. The high, vaulted ceiling was at least 2 stories high, and hung with curtains of burgundy velvet. Imitation Renaissance paintings in garish gold frames seemed to fit what she remembered of that period. Or did they? Yet that furniture was classic Auroran design, developed many centuries later. She looked up again, trying to orientate herself, and shuffled quickly to one side to catch her balance. This room was also askew. Worse than that, she guessed it was not built on angles at all. Though the corners of the ceiling and walls were partially hidden by curtains, the whole room seemed oddly round, even twisted out of shape, as though the room had begun as a rectangle and started to melt, and then had frozen again. She started across the room to look more closely at the furniture. After 4 steps, the floor gave out beneath her and she fell, sliding this time down a short, twisting chute. She heard the trap door above her hiss close again as she landed somewhere else with a thump. This room was tiny, with just barely enough room for her to stand up. It, too, was in the shape of the keys. There was a door in each wall that was big enough, and nothing else. The walls glowed with light, as in the compass tower. She pressed a stud by one of the doors. The door slid open to reveal a solid, glowing wall. She opened another one. This door opened to reveal a dark, narrow hallway. Before trying it, she pushed another stud. A weirdly sculptured face stared at her from an archaic red brick wall. It had pointed ears, a long pointed face, and was laughing. Grimacing, she closed that one and tried another. Another dark hallway stretched in front of her. She had to go somewhere. With a glance at the other open doorway, she edged inside. The walls here didn't glow, and she slid her feet carefully along the floor before committing her weight forward. After a few steps the corridor began to curve. A moment later she followed right back to the same little room again. And thus ends this chapter. Only 2 left, and they're like the longest chapters in the book. Alright. Hope you enjoyed and have a good day. Bye!